James Callahan reached City Hall as dawn's first light bled across the frost-dusted sidewalk, his shadow stretching long and thin, a fragile echo of a man clinging to memory. Veterans Day banners swayed in the November wind, their blue and white fabric whispering, honor, sacrifice, service, words that hung heavy in the crisp air but rarely touched the earth. His faded green field jacket, too thin for the biting cold, clung to his gaunt shoulders, its patches frayed but defiant, each stitch a relic of jungles crossed, battles survived, and comrades lost. Beneath it, a shirt too large for his frame and trousers cinched with an old canvas belt formed the uniform of a man who owned little but carried everything. His boots, once polished to a mirror shine, were scuffed and cracked, the leather splitting like parched earth. The soles, glued twice with makeshift resolve, flapped faintly with each step, yet they bore him forward, as they had through rice paddies, ruined cities, and now the quiet indifference of his homeland. He had risen before dawn in the shelter's dim dormitory, splashing cold water on his face from a sluggish faucet, combing his thinning gray hair with trembling fingers, and buttoning his shirt with the slow precision of ritual. This was his ceremony, unchanged for years, a silent vow to show up, to be seen, even if no one looked. In his coat pocket, pressed against his chest, was a worn envelope, its edges soft from years of handling. Inside, a faded photograph of 4 young soldiers, a folded discharge paper, and an expired VA card, useless now but sacred to him. It wasn't proof for others, it was an anchor, tethering him to a life that still mattered, even if the world had moved on. As he approached the marble steps of City Hall, gleaming under the pale morning light, his breath clouded in the cold, each exhale a fleeting mark of his presence. The steps were wide and unyielding, and James climbed them with measured care, one hand in his pocket, the other guarding the envelope as if it might slip away. His joints ached, each step a reminder of shrapnel still lodged in his hip, too deep for doctors to remove. Inside, the lobby glowed with polished stone and artificial warmth. Flags flanked velvet ropes, podiums bore the city's seal, and volunteers bustled with rehearsed smiles, arranging chairs and trays of pastries. Their eyes, trained to seek veterans in crisp uniforms or with polished medals, slid past James, catching on the stains of his jacket, the uneven hem of his pants, the faint shadow of stubble on his sunken cheeks. He was invisible, a ghost in their midst. He approached the checkpoint with the caution of a man who'd navigated minefields, his steps soft, his posture unthreatening. A table stood beneath a banner proclaiming, "Welcome, heroes," manned by a young official in a crisp suit, checking names. James offered the envelope, his fingers steady despite the ache in his joints. The official barely glanced at it, his eyes flickering with discomfort and dismissal. A heavy pause stretched, thick with unspoken judgment. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice polite but firm. "We need proper ID. The event's at capacity. You can watch outside, there's a screen, coffee, a tent if it gets windy." The words cut, sharp in their familiarity. James had heard them before, in shelters, at clinics, in lines for benefits that never came. Rules. Standards. Capacity. Always a reason to turn him away. He nodded, his face betraying nothing, and turned back to the steps. His boots echoed faintly as he descended, each step a quiet act of dignity in a world that offered none. At the base of the stairs, a lone folding chair leaned against the wall, its metal frame rusted at the joints. He took it, setting it in a corner where the wind bit less fiercely, and sat, his hands resting on his knees, his shoulders settling into a posture that had carried him through worse than cold. The world moved around him. Men in suits, women in pressed dresses, and veterans in newer uniforms streamed past, their laughter and greetings filling the air. Some glanced at him, a flicker of curiosity, a moment of pity, before looking away. A few nodded, their acknowledgement as brief as a salute. No one stopped. James didn't expect them to. Invisibility was his inheritance, a shadow cast by a nation that loved its heroes in theory but struggled with their reality. His pale blue eyes, sharp despite his years, fixed on the horizon, seeing beyond the plaza to places only he could name, Ki San, Da Nang, the muddy hills where he'd left pieces of himself. Inside, the ceremony began. Music drifted through the heavy doors, a brass band playing Sweet Caroline, then a choir's rendition of America the Beautiful. Speeches followed, amplified by speakers tucked behind potted ferns. Words like valor, duty, and freedom floated outward, polished and weightless, like coins too worn to hold value. Applause rose and fell, a rhythm that felt distant, unreachable. James listened, his face still, his heart heavy with the gap between the words and the truth they claimed to carry. The banners promised honor, but honor was in the mud, in the names he'd never forget, in the weight he carried alone. His fingers brushed the envelope, tracing its familiar edges. He didn't open it. The photograph, him, Danny, and two others, grinning on a crate in Da Nang, their faces young and unscarred, lived in his mind as clearly as the day it was taken. Danny's laugh, rough and bright, echoed in his memory, a sound from a time when hope still had a shape. The discharge paper, its ink faded, bore the words honorable service, a promise etched in his soul. The VA card, expired and useless, was a bitter reminder of vows made and broken. These were his relics, not for display but for survival, grounding him when memory threatened to pull him under. An hour passed, then two. The cold seeped into his bones, tightening his back, numbing his fingers. His breath grew slower, each exhale a quiet defiance. He closed his eyes, and Khe Sanh rose around him, the drone of choppers, the crack of gunfire, the weight of Danny slung across his shoulders. "Stay with me," he'd whispered, dragging his friend through the mire, ignoring the blood seeping from his own leg. He could still feel the mud, smell the smoke, hear the crackle of a radio calling for evac. He'd carried 3 men to safety that night, his strength fueled by something beyond reason. Danny wasn't one of them. His name, written in a journal long lost, still lived in James's whispers, a prayer against forgetting. Ellen's face came next, her smile soft in the glow of their apartment's single lamp. She'd read to him, Keats, Whitman, her voice steady even when his hands shook. Her laughter had been sunlight, warming the cracks in his soul. When cancer came, it stole her slowly, her body fading but her spirit fierce. He'd held her hand, reading back the poems she loved, his voice cracking as she slipped away. "You're enough, James," she'd whispered, her eyes holding his until the end. The emptiness that followed was a wound he couldn't name, one that grew in shelters, in the flicker of streetlights, in the cold of this plaza. Michael, his son, was a sharper pain, a wound that never healed. He saw him at Ellen's funeral, tall in his marine blues, his salute perfect but his eyes distant. James had wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. War had taught him silence, and silence had built a wall between them. Michael's letters, full of hope at first, grew sparse, then stopped. The last one, unopened, was a weight James couldn't bear to lift. He didn't blame his son. He blamed himself, for the man he couldn't be, for the father he'd failed to become. The ache pulsed beneath his ribs, as steady as his slowing breath. The crowd spilled out, their voices bright with the afterglow of ceremony. They spoke of the keynote speaker, a general with a chest full of medals, the slideshow of young soldiers, their smiles frozen in time, the coffee that had gone cold. Some posed for photos by the banners, their coats thick against the wind. A few approached the veterans who'd sat in the front rows, offering handshakes and murmured thanks. No one saw the man in the corner, except a small girl in a red scarf who paused at the steps. Her eyes, wide and curious, met James's, her breath puffing in the cold. "Mama, who's that?" she asked, tugging her mother's sleeve. The woman glanced over, her face softening for a moment before she pulled her daughter along. "Come on, sweetie," she said, not looking back. James watched them go, a faint ache in his chest, not anger, not even sorrow, but the bruise of being unseen. He had outlived his war, his family, his place in the world. What remained was this, the act of showing up, of sitting in the cold, of carrying the envelope no one would read. It was enough. It had to be. The plaza emptied, the wind softening to a low moan, leaving only the rustle of banners and the distant hum of traffic. The chairs were stacked, the coffee cups swept away, the lights in City Hall dimmed to a faint glow. The afternoon tipped toward dusk, the cold sinking into his joints like an old enemy. His hands, once steady enough to field strip a rifle under fire, trembled faintly, resting open on his knees. He didn't clench them. There was no need to fight the cold anymore. It was part of him, like the ache in his back or the weight in his chest. He tilted his head back, his eyes tracing the banners. Honor. Sacrifice. The words mocked him, not because they were false, but because they were incomplete. They didn't speak of the nights spent staring at a ceiling, the faces that never faded, the silence that followed when the world moved on. Memory was his companion now, as real as the frost on his jacket. He thought of the men he'd carried, their weight more than physical, their names a litany he recited in the dark. He thought of the letters he'd written home, folded in a metal box, their ink smeared by jungle rain. He thought of Ellen's voice, reading poetry in the quiet of their apartment, her hand steady in his. He thought of Michael, a boy who'd once climbed onto his lap, asking for stories of heroes, not knowing his father was one. The memories were sharp, cutting through the fog of years, each one a reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd kept. A janitor emerged, pushing a bin across the plaza. His eyes skimmed over James, pausing for a moment before returning to his task. A family hurried past, their children clutching tiny flags, their voices fading into the night. Across the street, the Veterans Museum flickered to life, its lights casting a warm glow on the statue of an unknown soldier. James watched it, his heart heavy with irony. Unknown, yet remembered. He, known to himself, was forgotten. The museum's displays, interactive screens, polished metals, photos of young faces, spoke of wars that felt distant, sanitized. Where were the stories of men like him, whose courage was in surviving, in carrying the weight of memory when no one else would? He reached for the envelope, his fingers stiff but deliberate. He held it in both hands, its weight a comfort against the cold. He didn't open it. The photograph was too fragile for this wind, the discharge paper too worn for scrutiny, the VA card too bitter to revisit. Together, they were his truth, proof that he'd been more than a shadow, more than a man in a chair. As the wind carried the faint strains of taps from the museum's candlelight vigil, he closed his eyes, letting the notes curl around him like a prayer. The melody was a bridge to barracks, to graves, to moments when he'd stood with others, bound by something stronger than words. Dusk deepened into night, the streetlights painting the plaza in amber and shadow. Snow began to fall, soft and relentless, dusting his jacket, his boots, his hands. It gathered in the folds of his trousers, on the brim of his cap, but he didn't brush it away. It was part of the moment, like the wind, like the ache in his chest. His breath slowed, each exhale fainter, yet still there, a quiet rhythm against the night. His eyes, open now, stared beyond the plaza, to a place where Danny laughed, where Ellen smiled, where Michael still looked at him with hope. The cold reached his bones, his hands resting open, his shoulders slack. He thought of leaving, of shuffling back to the shelter, to the cot that smelled of bleach and despair. But he stayed. Not out of stubbornness, but necessity. To leave would be to surrender the one thing he still controlled, his presence. He had come for the banner's promise, for the memory of those who couldn't, for the boy he'd been, who'd believed in duty. He stayed for the man he'd become, who knew that duty wasn't in the banners or the speeches, but in the act of showing up, of bearing witness, of refusing to vanish. The plaza was empty now, the banners still, the lights dim. A single figure moved in the distance, a security guard, his flashlight sweeping the steps. He paused near James, his beam catching the snow on the veteran's jacket. "Hey, sir," he called softly, his voice hesitant. "You okay?" James didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his breath a faint cloud. The guard lingered, then stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. He saw the envelope, the weathered hands, the face carved with lines of loss. "Sir," he said again, softer, "it's too cold out here." James stirred, his voice a low rasp. "I'm fine, son. Just, remembering." The guard hesitated, his flashlight lowering. He was young, too young to know Khe Sanh, but his eyes held something, recognition, perhaps, or respect. "You served?" he asked. James nodded, a small movement, his hand tightening on the envelope. The guard stood there a moment longer, then reached into his pocket. "Here," he said, pulling out a thermos and pouring hot coffee into the lid. He set it on the ground beside James. "Keep warm, all right?" James looked at the cup, steam rising in the cold, and felt a warmth that wasn't just physical. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The guard nodded, his flashlight sweeping away as he continued his rounds, leaving James alone once more. He didn't touch the coffee, but its presence was enough, a small gesture, a crack in the wall of his invisibility. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the plaza in silence. James sat, his silhouette a part of the stone and shadow, his presence as enduring as the marble steps. He was not waiting for recognition or salvation. He was there, a man who'd lived without monuments, who'd die without them, but who'd kept his promise to remember. The cleaning crew would come at dawn. They'd find the chair, the man, the envelope. Someone might read the name, James Callahan, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Vietnam, 1967 to 1969. Someone might pause, might wonder about the life behind the name. But James didn't need their wonder. He had left his mark, in the mud of Khe Sanh, in the silence of forgotten rooms, in the breath that refused to fade. He had carried Danny, loved Ellen, hoped for Michael. He had come, as the banner asked. He had remained, as he'd promised himself. And in the quiet of that cold night, with snow settling like a shroud, it was enough. His eyes closed, his breath softened, and the envelope rested against his heart, a final anchor in a world that hadn't seen him but could never erase him.